How are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populace. Thank you again for joining me. You may have not been aware, but there was actually an important meeting at the Council for Foreign Relations, a very powerful U.S. think tank, and it's something of a shadow government here in the United States. Most of our leaders have a connection with the CFR, and people from the CFR at all points in time populate the US government. Now, a week and a half ago, um, Antony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, was having a CFR meeting with Richard Haas, who interviewed him. And Richard Haas has been president of the CFR since 2003. And during this interview, they covered domestic issues a little bit, but mostly they were talking about China, Russia, the world order, and the challenges moving forward for the United States. Now, what I find interesting watching, having watched this interview, is that although Anthony Blinken is the Secretary of State of the United States, when he's interacting with Richard Haas, he doesn't really come off like he is the big fish in the room, despite the fact that he is, again, the Secretary of State. He seems more like a pupil talking to one of his professors rather than the other way around. And I think this is an interesting observation because our government figures, they aren't beholden to us, the people. Um, they're beholden to the Washington, D.C. establishment. And just because Richard Haas isn't in government doesn't mean that he's not incredibly powerful, so that even a high ranking member of the government sort of interacts with him in this way where Haas clearly is the big fish in the room. And as I said, every government has members of the CFR in it. And that shows you the power of the CFR and of not just the CFR, but these groups in general, think tanks. They control US policy. The people are part of these think tanks come into the government, but they're still part of that behind the scenes grouping of elites that shape policy and put their people in place in the government. And I think I forget who said this, but someone made the point that it doesn't matter who the president is, the same people will populate the deep state, the bureaucracy. And when Trump was president, for example, he had Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State for a while, and Pompeo was in the military, in Congress, director of the CIA, and then the Secretary of State. And if you look at Pompeo's actions and his sort of his viewpoints or um, his collective philosophy, it's really no different than Anthony Blinken. And that's what's so frustrating. Republican, Democrat, the machine just keeps on tugging along and moving in the direction that the elites want. So our democracy is in some way, unfortunately, a sham. So I want to play about 5 minutes of Anthony Blinken um, talking about the current state of our globe, and I'll stop it. Well, I'll stop it every so often to really hone in on something he said because what he's saying I think is very interesting. There are things that really remember this conversation is not necessarily for us, even though it's available to us. These are the elites talking to one another. This is what they're thinking. And their conversation, again, is amongst themselves, 99% of people, well, more than that, 99.99999% of people will never watch this interview, will never hear what he has to say, and will be blissfully unaware. And when they go vote, they'll be voting based off of the stupid cliches that our politicians say, not on what the real issues are for the people actually running this country. So let me start this clip. One second here. There we go.
Thank him for that, but I'm still going to ask him tough questions. I tried.
And there's Richard Haas on the right.
So I think for most of us, as we're looking at where we are, I think there's a recognition that we really are at an inflection point. And an inflection point comes around every few generations where there's such profound changes taking place that in many ways the decisions that we're making right now are likely to shape what comes next, not just for the next few years, but arguably for the next few decades. And we're one of those moments. I think from where we sit, where I sit, this won't be news to a lot of people in this room, the post-Cold War era is over. And there is a profound competition underway right now to shape what comes next. We had a strong consensus coming out of the Cold War. We thought that major power competition was over. We thought we'd have an integrated global economy in which commerce ultimately trumped geopolitical competition.
Let me stop right there. The post-Cold War era is over, and he's saying we thought that we would have this integrated world economy. And what he's really pointing at is the fact that in the 90s, the United States, we were the sole superpower. So we were in the catbird seat. We were controlling everything. China hadn't risen up yet. Russia was in shambles. So this post-Cold War era he's talking about really means complete U.S. hegemony. And as you can see here, he loved that. That's fantastic. But then he points out that there's this reemergence of powers fighting each other, which, as he obviously says here, is not a good thing. But it's funny because I think that was ignorant to think that this wouldn't rise again. And this goes back to the issue of our expectations for people like China, for Russia. We thought that they would fold into our liberal system, and we would remain to be being the driver. And that's not how things unfolded, as we know. And that's where we're at now, having this struggle with China, Russia, United States, now starting to all elbow each other for more power.
We thought we'd have former rivals working together to deal with big transnational problems. And I think we all thought that political and economic openness would be mutually reinforcing. And to some extent, I don't want to minimize it, we did have, in many ways, an era of extraordinary progress. I think if you take the Steven Pinker view of the world and step back and look at the aggregate, at least until the Great Recession, and arguably even until COVID, in the aggregate, we did see the world getting safer, more prosperous, a little bit more equal, healthier, wiser. And so I think there was a view that we were on a relatively positive trajectory. But then, of course, we've seen the emergence of major disruptors that are now, I think, pushing us past that era that we hoped would be lasting, but turns out not to be. Obviously,
I wonder who those major disruptors are. China and Russia. Major disruptors, like how he describes that.
The rise of China that has both the power and the intent to change the system that we're living in. A revanchist Russia that we're dealing with every single day. A panoply of interrelated and unfortunately mutually reinforcing transnational challenges, global challenges that we have to find a way to deal with effectively. And with all of that, I think a few things that we've all experienced that we're grappling with the consequences of right now. Even as arguably inequities between countries grew less. We've seen inequities within them grow. We've seen information systems proliferate in a way that has gotten beyond what we anticipated. The democratization of information has had all of the unintended and second and third order consequences that people know. We've had a democratic recession around the world. We may have had something of a democratic recession here at home. And all of these things together have created, I think, a perfect storm moment, which makes this an inflection point. So for us, the challenge is, how do we organize ourselves best to deal with that? To deal, on the one hand, with the emergence or reemergence of great power rivalries, but also with a tsunami of transnational challenges that are having a profound effect on the lives of our own citizens, whether it is health, whether it is migration, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's energy. You all know the list, and we can go down it. And of course, the geopolitical competition part, the transnational challenge part, are profoundly interrelated in ways that we can get into. We have a vision that is clear and unambiguous for what we'd like the world to become: free, secure, open, prosperous. And that's a cliche, but it actually means something. It means societies in which individuals
We should stop helping other countries.
choose their own lives freely. It means countries that are free to decide what their path will be, who their
Well, countries deciding what their path should be. The last 75 years, 80 years of U.S. foreign policy is us punishing countries that choose a different path, something that we don't like. So it's again one of these things I always criticize the United States for, is this double standard, or what we say we support, we don't actually support if it goes contrary to our geopolitical goals.
partners will be. It means an international system that's built around rules, transparently, applied fairly and equitably, with goods, with information, with people flowing lawfully and freely.
The international rules-based order that's applied transparently and fairly. I've talked about this a million times. We don't apply it fairly. We break the rules all the time, and it's not always clear what the rules are. But we keep on saying it like it means something. It only means something if everybody understands what it is.
And it means technology used to uplift people, not to keep them down. On the other hand, we have increasingly some actors, some countries that want to erase many of the rules, the norms, the standards that we've developed over 75 years as a Western construct that shouldn't apply to them.
And this goes back to the idea that the Western, the rules-based international order is something that we in the West basically said everybody in the world should follow, whether or not they agreed. And now that China is the second biggest economy in the world, they're saying, we didn't agree to this. We didn't sign on to this. You can't take your rules-based international order and just project it onto us. There has to be some sort of agreement from our side. But we in the West don't look at it that way. We think our way is the best way, and we can argue about whether or not that's true. But either way, it has to be agreed upon, and we don't accept that. We want people to follow because, well, we made the rules, so if people follow it, that's usually good for us, and that keeps us in power.
We have a reassertion in some cases of spheres of influence. We have countries that are using predatory non-market practices to get
spheres of influence. That's not something that's reemerged. We still have that here in the United States. And to think that this is something that only Russia or China does is ridiculous. We deal with two, Monroe Doctrine. So this is a reality of any powerful country. They try to control the areas around them, and certainly we do. So that's the issue we're facing in Taiwan, and that's the issue we're facing with Ukraine and Russia. These are nothing new, been going on forever.
gain economic power and influence. We have the weaponization of dependencies, the weaponization of information, and we have assertions that what we see as universal rights are purely internal questions. So there are two very different views of the world, and there may well be a desire on the part of those who have a different view for a world order, but it's an illiberal one, and ours remains at heart a liberal one. So there's going to be a contest to shape this future.
And I'll stop it there. And as he points out, or he says, he goes, we have a liberal, view of the world, and a liberal one, and the liberal one is better, and we're going to try to shape the world that way. And of course, the illiberal one is China, Russia, and those are the ones we reject. A problem again is both of those countries have nuclear weapons. They have, well, in the case of China, a very strong economy. And no matter what we believe to be the case, we simply can't force our views on other countries. There has to be negotiations, talks, so that we can coexist peacefully. The problem is, as I pointed out in other videos, we view the world or geopolitics as a zero-sum game where if China is stronger or Russia is a little stronger, that is detracting from us in the United States and threatening our power and our security. And as long as we think that way, we're going to have this hostility that's obviously boiled over with Russia and Ukraine, and potentially with China and Taiwan. So here, Blinken showing the mentality of the ruling class here in the United States, how they view the world. His viewpoint, again, represents it all, not just his own. And whether it was him or whether it was any of Trump's Secretary of States, nothing will really change as far as our foreign policy. And if you become president, regardless of how much you want to change the system, you are held captive by the Washington, D.C. establishment. And the Secretary of State position, for example, is confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So you can grab somebody you think will change the system, but then the Senate, and most of the people in the Senate are terrible on both sides of the aisle, they will prevent that person from getting into the State Department and running that office. So that is I wouldn't say it's a downside, but in our government, the way it's structured, our checks and balances, it prevents any one person, even the executive, the president, from making too many changes that fast. And that's good in the sense that it might be dangerous to have somebody come in and flip the whole system over. I could see why people would, that's a dangerous thing, and why our founding fathers wanted to prevent that. But on the other hand, it leaves our government captive to a ruling class that behind the scenes can exert so much control that we, the people, no longer feel like we are living in a real democracy where our representatives are responding to us, and that's the unfortunate part. So interesting interview with Tony Blinken, and I will have a few more videos coming out. He talks about China, he talks about Russia, a lot of interesting things there. So look out for those videos coming soon. That's it for now. Cheers. And if you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.